God always has a meanwhile. God always has a meanwhile. Verse 58, the NIV uses this word and I like it. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. You ever see a movie where two guys are about to fight? They start taking off their jackets, taking off their watches, unbuttoning their sleeves. They're going to fight. Well, these religious leaders were taking off their coats, getting ready to pick up rocks, and they're going to throw rocks. And they take their coats and they lay their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. It's the first time we meet Saul. Saul was a meanwhile. Meanwhile, they laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. This horrible situation began the change that Saul needed to become Paul. Paul, the greatest apostle the church has had, wrote more of the New Testament letters than anyone, planted more churches, but he needed this. He needed this horrible situation and God working through it, this meanwhile situation, to change him. The worst of circumstances, the worst of situation, God has a meanwhile. This horrible thing was happening, but meanwhile, God was still doing something. This virus is going on, but meanwhile, God is still up to something. I guarantee you more people over the last 2 months have heard the message of Christ because of technology than maybe even in the history of the world. It's gone everywhere. Unemployment is going on, but meanwhile, God may be teaching us something. I'm not saying it's good, it's horrible. It's not a good thing. But meanwhile, 14.7% unemployment, not good. But meanwhile, maybe God's transforming the soul of our country. We have to stay at home, and that's terrible. But meanwhile, maybe God is growing our souls while we're having to do this. And the worst of circumstances, death itself, which is not good. I'm not saying it's good at all, and God does not cause it. But meanwhile, maybe He can put eternity in our hearts and show us what is truly important now and forever. We don't gloss over the horrible situation. What happened to Stephen was a terrible tragedy. It was horrible. But